We often think that narcissists feel nothing after they hurt us. They lie, manipulate, and walk away as if our pain is entertainment. But what if I told you, behind the mask of arrogance and control, there is pain? Silent pain. Narcissists betray because they fear vulnerability. They run from intimacy, not because they don't want it, but because they don't know how to hold it without breaking it. Their betrayal isn't proof of power. It's evidence of deep insecurity. When they betray you, it may seem like they've won. They move on quickly, they post, they pretend. But here's the truth. They don't heal, they recycle, they distract. And in the silence of the night, in the absence of applause and validation, they feel it, the emptiness. See, narcissists aren't immune to emotion. They're trapped by it. They're haunted by the very self they're trying to outrun. And when they lose someone who truly saw them, who truly cared, they know what they've done, but they'll never say it, because admitting the damage would mean confronting the one thing they fear most. Shame. You didn't lose, you learned, and while they wear their silence like armor, you get to heal with honesty, you get to grow, and in the end, that's real power. We often misunderstand why narcissists do what they do. We think they betray us because they don't care, because they're cruel, because they're heartless. But that's not entirely true. The truth is harder to accept, but far more powerful to understand. Narcissists betray not because they lack emotion, but because they're terrified of it. See, vulnerability is the birthplace of connection. It's where real love, real trust, and real intimacy begin. But to someone who has spent their entire life trying to prove they're enough, vulnerability doesn't feel like a door to connection. It feels like a trap. When a narcissist senses that someone is getting too close, when they feel truly seen, truly known, they panic. Not outwardly, not obviously, but deep down there's a voice screaming, what if they see the real me? What if I'm not enough? That fear drives them to sabotage the very thing they need most, closeness. And betrayal becomes their defense mechanism. It's how they take back control. It's how they escape the terrifying possibility of being exposed. Not for their strength, but for their weakness. Not for their confidence, but for their fragile sense of self. You might have offered them loyalty. You might have shown them patience. Maybe you forgave things others wouldn't. You held space for their pain, tried to understand their silence, and gave them a chance to meet you in a place of honesty. But when they betrayed you, it wasn't because you did something wrong. It was because you did something right. You got too close. And closeness demands honesty. It demands openness, and for someone who's built their identity on a mask, nothing is more threatening than the truth. Narcissists fear vulnerability the way some people fear drowning, and when they feel like they're sinking, they don't ask for help. They push the person closest to them away. Sometimes violently, sometimes quietly, but always with the same intent, to protect the illusion. So when the betrayal comes, it isn't about you, it never was. It's about their fear, their pain, their inability to sit with the discomfort of being truly known. But here's the part most people never see. After the betrayal, after they walk away, after they pretend nothing happened, they feel it, the silence, the absence, the weight of what they just destroyed. They might not say it, they might never show it, but they feel it. Because even though narcissists struggle to express emotion in a healthy way, they still feel it, they just don't know what to do with it. So they run from partner to partner, from friend to friend, from one source of validation to the next, not because they're happy, but because they're trying to outrun something that always catches up with them. And what they're running from is themselves. The moment someone gets close enough to see the cracks in the mask, the fear kicks in. That's when betrayal happens, not because they wanted to hurt you, but because they needed to protect their ego. Their false self, the image they've worked so hard to build, but that image is fragile. It's made of fear, not strength. We assume strength is about having all the answers, looking composed, appearing confident. But real strength, the kind that builds trust and creates connection, that comes from vulnerability, from the willingness to say, I don't have it all together, from the courage to admit, I'm scared, but I still want to try. That kind of strength terrifies the narcissist, because they've spent so long believing that being open equals being weak, that to love is to lose, that to trust is to be destroyed. And so, they betray before they can be betrayed. They leave before they can be left. They lie before they can be exposed. It's not rational, it's not fair, but it is human, and that's the heartbreaking part. They are human, deeply flawed, deeply afraid, and deeply disconnected from the very thing they crave most, genuine love. So no, they didn't betray you because they didn't care. They betrayed you because they cared, and didn't know how to handle it, and that is the real tragedy when we see someone acting with bravado, boasting, posturing, always needing to be right. It's easy to label it as confidence. It looks like strength, it looks like certainty, but often it's not. What we're seeing is insecurity in disguise. Insecurity doesn't always look like self-doubt. Sometimes it looks like control. Sometimes it sounds like arrogance. And sometimes it shows up in betrayal, because the one who betrays doesn't always feel powerful. They often feel powerless. Narcissists are a perfect example of this. At first glance, they seem untouchable. They're charismatic, charming, they know how to take up space and draw attention. But underneath all of that is a deep fear of inadequacy, a fear they've never dealt with, a fear they can't even admit to themselves. So they build an image, one that looks confident, one that looks successful, one that seems like they have it all together, but it's not real, it's a performance. And every performance requires an audience. That's why they need constant validation, because they're not trying to prove their worth to others, they're trying to convince themselves. And when someone threatens that illusion, when someone sees past the act, it shakes them. It terrifies them because it exposes something they've spent their entire life trying to hide, the truth that deep down they don't feel enough. This is why betrayal becomes their weapon of choice. Not because they want to cause pain, but because they feel pain and don't know what to do with it. When you begin to see who they really are, not the polished exterior, but the insecure, uncertain person underneath, they panic. They don't know how to handle being seen without judgment, so they assume judgment is inevitable, and instead of letting that happen, they sabotage, they attack, they run, and here's the most ironic part. In their mind, betrayal is a form of control. It's a way to reclaim power, but in reality, it's a sign of how little power they truly feel. Real confidence doesn't need to dominate. It doesn't need to manipulate. It doesn't need to betray. Real confidence says, I can be honest, even when it's hard. It says, I can face discomfort without hurting someone else in the process. But narcissists haven't learned that kind of strength. They only know the strength of the mask, the one they've been polishing for years, and the more fragile their self-worth, the more aggressive their behavior. Not because they want to harm, but because they've built their entire identity on the idea that being vulnerable equals being weak. That to be questioned is to be threatened, that to be challenged is to be humiliated. They don't see trust as something to build, they see it as something to control. They don't see relationships as spaces for growth. They see them as stages where they must perform, and the moment someone stops clapping, the show ends, so they betray to protect the mask, to protect the illusion, to protect the lie they've been living, that they are superior, invincible, above it all. But when they're alone, when the noise fades and the spotlight disappears, they're left with the same haunting truth. They don't believe they're enough, and that truth is heavy, heavier than they'll ever admit, heavier than most people realize, because no amount of followers, applause, or praise can silence the inner voice that whispers, "You're not as strong as you pretend to be." And until that voice is heard, understood, and healed, they'll keep repeating the same pattern. Over and over, hurting others to avoid their own hurt, sabotaging love to avoid rejection, wearing masks to avoid being seen, but deep down, they want to be seen, they want to be accepted, they want to be loved without conditions. Just like anyone else, they just don't believe they're worthy of it, and that belief, the one they never speak of, the one they never show, is the silent root of every betrayal. There's this illusion we tend to believe, that when someone betrays us and walks away without looking back, they feel nothing, they're cold, unaffected, almost proud. We think they must not care, they must be heartless. And on the surface, it looks true. They don't call, they don't explain, they don't apologize, but that's not the whole story. Just because someone is silent doesn't mean they're unbothered. Just because they show no emotion doesn't mean they feel no pain. And just because they act like they've moved on doesn't mean they actually have. See, narcissists are masters at masking discomfort. They've trained themselves not to show weakness, not even to the people closest to them, especially not to the people closest to them. So when they betray you, when they hurt you, and then disappear into the shadows or onto the next chapter without a word, it's not because they feel nothing. It's because feeling something scares them. After betrayal, a narcissist's world doesn't get quieter. It gets louder, not on the outside but inside. When the drama fades, when the validation disappears, when there's no one left to impress or manipulate, all they're left with is themselves, and that's the one person they've been avoiding all along. They feel the silence. They feel the absence of the connection they destroyed. They feel the loss, sometimes more than you might think. But what they don't have is the emotional language to sit with those feelings. So instead of processing them, they bury them, they distract themselves, new people, new stimulation, new highs, anything to avoid the low. They post like they're thriving, they laugh louder, they move faster, but all of it is noise. All of it is armor, because if they stopped, even for a moment, if they let the quiet in, they'd hear something terrifying. That whisper of regret, that small but relentless voice that says you ruined something good again. But they can't admit that, not out loud, because that would require ownership, it would require vulnerability. It would require them to see themselves not as the hero of their story, but as the one who caused the damage, and that's a truth they've spent years avoiding. So they pretend. They tell themselves you were never that important. That you were too sensitive, too demanding, too hard to love. They rewrite the narrative not because it's true, but because it's safer. Because rewriting the past is easier than facing what they did in the present. But deep down, in the quiet moments no one sees, they feel it. The cost of betrayal isn't always immediate. It creeps in over time, when a moment reminds them of you, when they hear a song, when they drive past that place. When they try to connect with someone new and realize it's not the same, it never is, and they know why, even if they never say it, they know they let go of something real, something human, something honest. And they know they did it not because it wasn't working, but because they didn't know how to make it work without losing control. That realization stings, and because they can't face it, they numb it. They try to replace what they lost, but no matter how many faces they chase or games they play, it doesn't fill the void. It doesn't quiet the silence, because silence doesn't go away when you ignore it. It grows, and the more they try to drown it out, the louder it becomes. That's why so many of them stay stuck in cycles, because healing requires humility, and they've built their entire identity on never being wrong. So no, they don't walk away unscathed. They just carry their pain differently, in secret, in silence, and that pain doesn't leave them. It follows them, because betrayal doesn't just hurt the one who's left behind. It quietly breaks the one who couldn't stay. When we talk about healing, we often imagine a process, something linear, a journey from pain to peace, with clear milestones along the way. But healing doesn't happen just because time passes. And for narcissists, it rarely happens at all. See, most people, when they experience heartbreak, regret, or guilt, eventually reach a point where they sit with those feelings. They reflect. They ask questions. Why did this happen? What could I have done differently? And in that uncomfortable space, growth begins. They learn, they feel, they change, but narcissists don't go there. They don't heal, they distract. The moment discomfort shows up, they look for the nearest exit. A new person, a new thrill, a new excuse. Anything to avoid the one thing they need the most, accountability. Because real healing demands that we take responsibility for our role in the story. And for someone who has built their entire identity on being right, that feels impossible. So instead, they replace. They rotate people like items on a shelf. They chase new attention, new admiration, new illusions of intimacy. But they're not connecting, they're coping, they're numbing themselves with novelty. It's like trying to quench thirst with salt water. It might feel satisfying in the moment, but it only makes the emptiness grow. When a narcissist betrays someone who truly saw them, They don't stop to ask, what did I lose? They jump straight to, who's next? And on the outside, it looks like they're winning, smiling, dating, thriving, but all that movement, it's not growth, it's escape, because healing is stillness. It's introspection. It's the slow, painful process of facing who we are without the mask. And that stillness is where a narcissist feels most threatened. They're addicted to distraction, to stimulation, to noise, because in the quiet they hear themselves. And they don't like what they hear. You'll notice this pattern if you've ever tried to confront one. They deflect, they blame, they twist the story, not because they don't understand, but because understanding would force them to see their reflection clearly, and the image in that mirror terrifies them. So instead of sitting with the truth, they run from it. They build narratives where they're the victim. They surround themselves with people who don't challenge them. They stay in shallow waters because the deep end, the place where healing happens, requires vulnerability. And they've spent their whole life avoiding that. You see it all the time. They go from relationship to relationship. They repeat the same mistakes, and each time the damage gets worse, not just for others, but for themselves. Because every distraction, every deflection, every denial adds to the internal chaos they're carrying. And here's what's tragic. They know something is wrong. They feel it. That restlessness, that emptiness, that cycle that never brings peace. But instead of slowing down and asking why, they speed up. They do more, chase more, need more. They confuse attention with love, validation with self, worth, control with connection. And that confusion keeps them stuck. They don't pause to grieve the people they hurt. They don't sit with the consequences of their choices. They move on, not forward, and there's a difference. Moving forward means growth. It means becoming wiser, gentler, more accountable. But narcissists don't evolve. They repeat. Because real change requires internal work. And their entire defense system is designed to avoid that work. So while you're at home healing in silence, while you're reflecting, learning, rebuilding, they're out there moving quickly but going nowhere, caught in the same loop, replaying the same story with different names and faces. And over time, the emptiness compounds, because they keep expecting something outside of themselves to fix what's broken inside, and nothing ever does. That's why the same behaviors continue. That's why the betrayals don't stop. That's why they never find what they're looking for, because they're searching for healing in all the wrong places, in distraction, in denial, in control. But healing doesn't happen through distraction. It happens through presence, through humility, through the courage to say, I was wrong and I want to be better. Until they learn to sit with that, nothing changes, no matter how many people they meet. No matter how many times they move on, no matter how many masks they wear, because you can't heal from what you won't face, and that's why they keep running. There's a kind of pain that isn't loud. It doesn't scream. It doesn't lash out. It just lingers. It follows people quietly, especially those who spend their lives pretending they're not in pain at all. Narcissists feel this pain in a way that's uniquely haunting, because they can't share it. Not really, they don't have the words for it. They don't have the tools, and the people who might have helped them through it, they've already pushed them away. That's one of the saddest parts of their story, how isolated they become. Not because they don't have people around them, but because they've burned bridges with the people who genuinely cared. The ones who were patient. The ones who tried to understand. The ones who offered grace even when it wasn't deserved. But narcissists don't recognize those people until they're gone. They take them for granted, thinking they'll always be there, they'll always come back. And when those people finally stop reaching out, when they stop forgiving, stop accepting the excuses, it shakes something deep inside. They don't show it, of course not. They'll post, they'll smile, they'll talk about how much better off they are. But underneath the noise, there's a quiet ache, an awareness that something real was lost. Not because of bad timing, not because things got too hard, but because they destroyed it. And now they're alone with that realization. But here's where it gets even more painful. Because narcissists don't allow themselves to grieve. Not properly, grief requires honesty. Grief requires admitting that you loved something, that it mattered, that you hurt it, and they've trained themselves to avoid that kind of emotional honesty at all costs. So instead of processing their pain, they compartmentalize it, they stuff it down, and they carry it into the next conversation, the next connection, the next conflict. They try to fill the hole with new attention, with new faces, with distractions that keep them from feeling the full weight of what they lost. But it doesn't go away. That pain sticks to them. It lives behind the eyes. In the silence after the high wears off, in the moment the room gets quiet and no one is clapping anymore, that's the moment the guilt creeps in. And for someone who's spent their life avoiding guilt, it's unbearable, so they do what they always do. They deflect it. They convince themselves you were the problem, that you were ungrateful, too emotional, too demanding, that the relationship wasn't as meaningful as it felt. But no matter how many times they rewrite the story, they can't change the ending. They lost something they didn't know how to keep, something good, something rare, and no version of the story where you're the villain can fully protect them from that truth. Because the truth doesn't disappear just because we ignore it. It waits. And for narcissists, it waits in the quiet, in those rare moments when the mask slips, when they're not performing, when they're just human, and that's when the pain shows up. Not just the pain of betrayal, but the pain of regret. The pain of not knowing how to love someone who loved them anyway. The pain of choosing ego over intimacy. The pain of realizing they had exactly what they needed, and let it slip through their fingers. That pain doesn't go away. It may soften, it may get buried, but it's always there. A reminder that even the people who seem the strongest on the outside are often the most fragile on the inside, and if they ever do change, if they ever decide to break the cycle, it won't be because someone forced them to. It'll be because that pain, that quiet pain, finally became too loud to ignore. Because when everything else fades, the truth remains. They weren't just hurting you. They were hurting themselves. There's this myth we carry around, that closure comes from conversation, that we need someone to come back, sit across from us, and explain why they did what they did. That if they just gave us a reason, an apology, a moment of truth, we could finally let go. But the reality is, people don't always come back, especially narcissists. They often leave without explanation, without remorse, without accountability, and waiting for them to return with answers becomes a kind of emotional limbo. A space where healing is always just out of reach, because we're waiting on someone who may never be capable of giving us what we need. Narcissists don't just betray people. They leave confusion in their wake. They take something real, twist it, damage it, and then vanish as if none of it ever mattered. And in that silence, we're left trying to make sense of something senseless. We replay conversations, we look for signs, we ask ourselves questions like, was it ever real? Did I miss something? Was it my fault? And here's where it becomes dangerous. Because narcissists don't give closure. They avoid it. Closure requires truth. It requires emotional honesty. And honesty threatens the image they've worked so hard to protect. So instead of clarity, they leave you with fragments, half-stories. Unfinished endings. They ghost, they lie, they move on too quickly, making it seem like you were never important. And when they do show up again, it's rarely to make things right. It's to reopen the wound. To regain control, to make you question your healing. So what do? We have to stop waiting for them to give us the peace they stole. Because the truth is, closure doesn't come from them, it comes from us. It comes from the moment we stop looking for answers in someone who built their entire life avoiding them. It comes when we stop hoping for validation from the very person who devalued us. It's not fair, I know. You didn't ask for this ending. You didn't ask to be hurt, manipulated, discarded. You showed up with honesty, with love, with loyalty, and in return you were left with silence. But here's what you gain in that silence, your power. Because when you stop chasing closure from them, you begin building it within yourself. You start to realize that their inability to show up at the end the way you deserved says more about them than it ever did about you. You didn't lose them, they lost you. They lost someone who would have stood by them, someone who believed in them, someone who saw them, even when they were hard to love, and that loss, it's not yours to carry. It's theirs even if they never say it, even if they never feel it in a way that looks familiar to you, it still exists. The silence they left behind is loud in their own life too, but they'll never tell you that. And they'll never give you the words you wanted to hear, so you give them to yourself. You give yourself the apology they won't offer, the compassion they withheld, the closure they were never equipped to give. You look in the mirror and you say, you didn't deserve what happened, you were enough, you are enough, and you don't need their permission to heal, because healing isn't a performance. It's not about showing them how strong you are. It's about rediscovering the strength that was always there, even when they tried to take it from you. You're not broken because they left. You're not unworthy because they didn't stay. Their inability to love doesn't define your ability to be loved. And while they keep running in circles, avoiding their pain, stuck in the same cycle, unable to face the truth, you get to break free, you get to choose peace over chaos, depth over drama, wholeness over wandering. You get to move forward, not bitter, not hardened, but wiser. That's your closure, not because they gave it to you, but because you gave it to yourself.